I'm here on a job site with Tim, who owns his own electrical contracting business.
3 employees and 2 work trucks.
Tim traded up to Greco Commercial Auto Insurance. We're positively here where he needs us most.
They sure are.
With step-by-step help on all his insurance needs, all for shockingly low rates.
Shockingly low, huh?
Just a little bit of electrician humour. Do you get it?
I got it.
You know, it feels like we have a real connection. All right, I'll stop.
Get a commercial auto insurance quote today at geico.com and see how much you could save. It feels good to Geico.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hi everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale and today I'm delighted to be joined or rejoined by Sir Christopher Frayling, who will be talking about Hollywood history of art. Before we go into the conversation, and you'll probably hear this repeated introduction, I just wanted to point out that on the February the 23rd from Plumeria Pictures, my new novel is being published. So if you go to their website, I'll put the link in the show notes. You can buy Connery, which is a book about a young man growing up into adulthood. It's a coming-of-age novel, if you like, but he has frequent visits from a certain Scottish film star. It is a work of fiction, and I'm very proud of it. I hope you enjoy it. Please pre-order it because it really helps. And it's at Plumeria Books. And the link is available, as I've already said. But before you do any of that, enjoy the conversation. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Sir Christopher Frayling, who we have had on the podcast previously talking about Sergio Leone and spaghetti westerns, but today he is here with a new book, a beautifully illustrated, how else could it be? How could it be otherwise? The Hollywood History of Art. Welcome, Sir Christopher.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be back, even with a different subject.
Yes, well, it's because I know you for your work on Sergio Leone spaghetti westerns generally, and to some degree Hammer horror and stuff that you've worked on in the horror field. So it's kind of interesting to see you approach this subject, which, according to your introduction, according to it's obviously not a new subject to you.
No, that's right. And in fact, it grows out of my day job, which sadly was never spaghetti westerns or Hammer horror. This other life of my day job, which is teaching at the Royal College of Art for many, many years, teaching postgraduate art students. And over the years, rather like barnacles sort of accumulating on a rock, this book developed because I used to run a course for the fine art students, that's painters, sculptors, printmakers and photographers, about the public image of artists. In other words, what do people think about them outside the art world? Because I've always felt that in the art world, we talk to ourselves a bit too much. We use our own technical language, which others call jargon. We're in a kind of bubble, and we don't think about how we're going over to that huge world out there that doesn't necessarily know very much about art, and maybe their only experience of art is through the movies and television. So I've always tried to encourage the students to think like that, about how are they going over to other people. So I ran this course and showed these Hollywood movies of artists, Charles Laughton as Rembrandt, Kirk Douglas as Van Gogh, George Sanders as Gauguin, etc., expecting the students to absolutely hate them, because critics and curators and art people generally tend to dismiss them to the point where they don't even talk about them. They don't appear on their visual threshold, you know. And the students loved them. They wanted to be like that, you know. I want to be, you know, inarticulate, passionate, difficult, have difficult domestic relationships, absolutely wedded to my art, don't need any help from anybody else. I want to be like Kirk Douglas as Van Gogh, you know. So I thought, well, this is quite interesting. So the next stage in it was finding a rather important book that I don't think gets written about very much. It's by two writers, Ernst Kriss and Otto Kurtz. And it was translated in the 1970s as Legend, Myth and Magic in the Image of the Artist. And they too are fascinated by the public image, the cultural impact of artists. And so they go back to all these sources, right back to ancient Greece, but particularly in the Renaissance and beyond, for the cliches that people hold about artists. That they're geniuses and don't need to go to art school. I always thought it was very ironic that my students loved these films because they're all about people who don't go to art school, or you never see them go to art school because they're born geniuses, you know. So you're a born genius. You don't need any help from anybody else. Your art is expressive rather than constructed or found. So you're pouring yourself out on the canvas. And ultimately, the life is much more interesting than the art out there, that people particularly interested in rather salacious details about artists' private lives and so on. So they treat the art as a kind of Rorschach test of the life. You just read the paintings off and you can tell exactly, one to one, exactly what's going on in the artist's life. So I thought, well, that's interesting. Those legends have been around for a long time, and clearly these films feed off them in order to seem convincing. You know, if you're going to distill someone's life into a truth, it's got to be a truth that works at that particular moment. So you've got to play to what people half have in mind already. And all those cliches were half there already. But you then add to that in the films all sorts of surface detail, obviously, to try and lure the viewer into believing everything you're showing. I mean, if you want to know about Renaissance scaffolding, watch The Agony and the Ecstasy with Charlton Heston as Michelangelo. If you want to know about the Yellow House in Arles, which was actually bombed in the war and doesn't exist anymore, watch Lust for Life with Kirk Douglas. If you want to know about Gainsborough's studio, particularly the way he shut out natural light because he only liked to work by candlelight, watch Kitty, which is a film made in 1946, which isn't often referred to in these things. So the surface details are incredibly well researched, and usually they have lots of technical advisors on the credits, on the visuals, rather than on the dialogue. But of course, the moment they open their mouth, you know you're in a completely different realm to that kind of authenticity. So anyway, I got fascinated by this. And one thing that Kurt and Chris say at the end of their book is that these cliches are so deep-rooted that they became a kind of what they call an enacted biography. In other words, young artists internalize these cliches and behave like that. And that really fascinated me in an art school context, the way that all these sort of cliches that people associate with artists are actually embedded in their own biography, because that's what they want to appear as. So we started having discussions and so on, and one thing led to another. And then whenever I was doing a radio or TV program in LA, I used to moonlight for an extra day or two by going to the studio archives. You know, a lot of the studios have donated their archives to the University of Southern California or UCLA. And so I'd start looking at these films one by one in great detail. In particular, this idea of how do you tell that story in a way that appeals globally? How do you tell the story of Michelangelo and sort of take it out of its historical Renaissance context and make it chime right across the world? You know, how did that thought process work? So I looked at those mechanisms, and there was a great day at the UCLA when I looked up The Agony and the Ecstasy, the Michelangelo film, and these envelopes arrived, bulging with primary material, and nobody had ever opened them. And I thought, this is virgin territory. I mean, who would? Film buffs aren't interested in that movie because, you know, I mean, much as we love Carol Reed, the director, it's not his greatest hit. I mean, you know, watch The Third Man, or I don't know, all his other films, but or Oliver even. But it isn't considered one of his greatest hits. So the film buffs wouldn't have opened the envelope, and art historians wouldn't have opened the envelope because they're not interested in Charlton Heston as Michelangelo. So I began to realize this is actual virgin territory, a lot of this. People haven't looked at these films in great detail. And over the years, it built up until I was ready to do a book, really. And I tell you, one thing that's really annoyed me about the reviews is that they've referred to the subject as very niche. And when I did a book about the public image of scientists a few years ago for Reaction Books, which tried, not in such detail, but tried to look at the public image of scientists through Hollywood movies. everyone says that's a really important subject. The public image of scientists is really important. It actually affects science policy and affects how we feel about putting money into research and so on. But you mention artists and suddenly it's niche. And that annoyed me a bit, that it is just as important as the book about scientists, because the public image of art also affects public policy and how people feel about government money going into the arts and all these other, and universities doing humanities and the arts, all these other things. So it annoyed me a bit that it's called, I don't think it's niche. I think it's an important and actually very relevant subject in the month when there's been a government inquiry into the Arts Council and how much money it should be putting into the visual and performing arts. It couldn't be more relevant. The public image of the artists out there. What do the voters think about art? That kind of thing.
Absolutely. Anyway. No, absolutely. I totally agree. And I think there is so many misconceptions out there, and this book is a splendid way of interrogating them via Hollywood. I think the relationship as well between artists and the public is one of those myths which you bring up in terms of the book from the 1970s. The sense that an artist is always sort of ahead of their time and uncelebrated in their time, when actually many of these artists were perfectly well celebrated and perfectly well.
I know. And if you look at the opposite, imagine an artist who creates steadily, soberly, methodically. He finds a market and works for it. He's businesslike, he's cool, he's calculating, he's money conscious, he's wide awake. Imagine an artist like that. You never get a movie about an artist like that. What price Renoir, what price John Singer Sargent, what price Matisse. They thought like that very often. And yet
Andy Warhol, for that matter.
Exactly. So you don't get, you've got to be an artist with a problem. Well, actually, as I say in the book, it's not so much a painter with a problem as a problem who happens to paint.
That's such a great line. That's such a great line. And you have one of the writers from The Agony and the Ecstasy, I think the main screenwriter, whose name escapes me momentarily.
Philip Dunn.
That's right. He says that, Van Gogh painting is not cinematic, but cutting his ear off is. You have to go for the action rather than for creation. Which reminded me, there was a film, and again, you'll have to help me with the title, I'm sure you'll know it. Emmanuel Baer was in it, and it was a French film. And it was basically, they're in the countryside and there's a conversation about art, and the artist decides to paint Emmanuel Baer. And I
think it was a month in the country or something like that.
And it basically just is about the process of him painting her. And so it just takes there's 10 minutes on him selecting a brush and sharpening a pencil and stuff. And it's just it is actually incredibly involving, but you kind of have to sit with it a while, and it's the exception that kind of proves the rule, I suppose.
Oh yeah. No, I'm thinking it was another one. It was called the something tree. What's it? It went on forever. Yes, no, I remember. And I think, because the book's about Hollywood, and although I refer to French and German and things, but the best Hollywood movies sort of nod towards those processes, where, for example, in Rembrandt with Charles Laughton, Laughton being that sort of actor, he went to art school to learn how to hold a brush. Because one of the great giveaways is when these people stand in front of a canvas, usually wearing a beret and a smock, and they do this funny thing with their hands, as if to sort of measure things out as a rectangle on the size of you've never seen an artist do that in your life, But what Laughton did was he attacks the canvas with the brush in a way that makes it look as though he's really painting and means it. And much more recently, Mr. Turner, the same thing. And in fact, in Mr. Turner, Mike Leigh had him grinding his paints and going to the paint shop and marketing his pictures so that he puts his pictures in a darkened room with a curtain round them, chats to the clients, and then they go into the room and all the lights come on suddenly, all the candles come on, and so the paintings become like a revelation, and they hope they buy one. So he markets and he has processes. I think the best films about artists nod towards that without going mad, without taking half an hour to hold a brush. But no, I think, and it depends on the actor. Some of the actors took it seriously and tried to sort of internalize what it must be like to be an artist. Others seem to go through the motions.
I've found the film I was referring to. I'm going to be very careful about
The
pronouncing
quince
this.
tree is not.
No, it's La Belle Noiseuse,
Yes, that's right. That's right.
directed by Jacques Rivet.
Does it have an English title?
The Beautiful Troublemaker.
Oh no, it's not the one I was thinking of. Right, okay, yeah. La Belle Noiseuse. Yes, I saw it. I've seen it. It goes on forever, but it's very convincing. And in fact, at the end of the book, I refer to this film that someone submitted almost as a joke to the British Board of Film Classification called Paint Drying, and it was a statement about why does it cost so much to have certification when you're an independent artist, and why do you have to pay so much to get a certificate? So he sent this thing, which is really it lasts for hours. Over 10 hours, and you just have to watch paint drying. I guess that's the most authentic painting about art that's ever been made.
or it's reality TV with all the location, and DIY shows.
Exactly.
It's really interesting as well because you're doing this book chronologically, so you're going from in terms of the cinema representations rather than the artists themselves.
Yeah. In fact, just on that, I start in 1933 with The Affairs of Cellini, the first sound film about a real live artist. And I did quite a lot of digging in silent film because I couldn't work out why there aren't any silent films about real life artists. And I consulted with Kevin Brownlow, the great historian of silent film. And we could think of lots of fiction films where the lead character is an artist. For example, Valentino in The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse is a struggling artist in Paris from a gaucho background, which is slightly peculiar. But anyway, never mind. He's a gaucho who's struggling as an artist in Paris. So you do get fiction films about struggling artists, but neither of us could think of a single silent film which is the life of a real life artist. And so I begin in the sound era in 1933 with The Affairs of Cellini, after which there are quite a lot.
It's also interesting, I found, that cinema itself, being obviously a visual art, is being inspired by the artists. And you mentioned Rembrandt lighting as being a very important point. I was interviewing a cinematographer for my book on Terrence Malick, and he told me how Malick would instruct the actors to Vermeer themselves.
Interesting shorthand, isn't it? And in fact, Rembrandt lighting goes way back. Cecil B. DeMille always claimed that he'd invented the phrase when trying to explain why a film in the late teens that he'd made, trying to explain to the front office in New York why it was so dark. So he said to them, it's Rembrandt lighting, at which point the front office said, well, for Rembrandt lighting, we can charge double. This sounds great. But actually, I did a little bit of digging, and if you look in photography manuals of the late 19th century, already they're referring to Rembrandt lighting. This concept's been around for a long time. I mean, not surprisingly, because his paintings are about light very often. So he's the man, But yes, and it becomes shorthand with technicians. It's quite fascinating, actually. Give it a Vermeer, give it a Rembrandt, etc. And that's another way in which art gets into the bloodstream. That we associate artists with a particular technique. Rembrandt equals lighting, etc. And it's. But I'm afraid Cecil B. rather made up that story, I think, or it was a good yarn.
The cinematographers that you mentioned as well, Jack Cardiff is one who works on. Is it Rembrandt? He is the one he's working on.
Yes,
with Charles Laughton.
Yes, he worked for Corda at Denham Studios. He didn't actually work on Rembrandt, but he was a very important cinematographer, very involved in early Technicolor experiments at Denham Studios and so on. And I interviewed him when he was in his declining years at the National Film Theatre, and he insisted on a series of slides of Rembrandt. So side lighting. Lighting behind the face, so the face gets a kind of halo, and all the different stages of Rembrandt's life. He said, well, a lot of artists, we have one image of them as a young person and one image of them as an old person. But in the case of Rembrandt, he documents each year of his life with a whole series of self-portraits. So he's incredibly useful to cinematographers who are lighting someone who's supposed to be aging. and so on. So it was fascinating, actually, to talk to him about it. He claimed he got the job at Denham because he spent the entire interview, instead of talking about lenses and film stock, talking about fine artists, Picasso, and showing off like mad all the artists that he'd heard of. And he claims that no one in the interview room had heard of any of the artists, so they thought he must be a genius, so he got the job at Denham. I think he was being a little modest.
Absolutely. So with Cellini, I mean, one of the problems with him as an artist, and this is sort of becomes a theme throughout the book, is also that at this early stage, the filmmakers are unsure how much they can rely on any foreknowledge of the artists themselves, and so the films are to some degree being educational rather than exploiting a sort of very famous person.
Yes, that's right. And in the case of Cellini, they spent ages working out whether there should be a prologue that tells you, what's the Renaissance, what's Florence, what's this guy doing in Florence, who was ruling the Florence, who are the Medicis, and in the end, they stripped it right down to a very short sort of caption, say, Florence, city of blood, city of romance, and the Medicis are in charge, dissolve, and the movie starts. But they agonized for a long time, and that's quite a big issue in these films. How much can you assume the public knows already? You don't want, on the one hand, to patronize the audience by overdoing the educational side of it. On the other hand, you don't want to make it too challenging because they don't know what the hell's going on. So there's lots of debates, and I found this from the archives, about how far you can push foreknowledge of these things. In the case of Cellini, it actually strides two different censorship systems in Hollywood. When they developed the project, things are fairly loose. It's pre-code. And so you can get away with quite rude things. And in fact, there was a scene in the script of Cellini jumping out of a window with his trousers off, having quite obviously done something terribly naughty with his mistress, and rushing into the street and being terribly kind of swashbuckly about it all. And slowly, they lose the trousers. He has to have his trousers on. He has to have his buttons done up. He has to be wearing a shirt. And there's a whole series of studio memos slowly watering it down so it'll get through the now tightened up production code by the time the movie came out in 1933. So that's another issue. I mean, you're telling uncensored lives, but you're being forced to make them conventional. And that's a hell of a pressure, Another pressure that they all felt was litigation. They were very worried if it was a recent artist or an artist, say, from the late 19th century onwards, from relatives suing them for using unpublished material or for defaming or whatever it was. And I found various examples of this, which are really fascinating. Van Gogh's nephew made real trouble for Lust for Life, wouldn't lend any pictures, wouldn't lend them, quote, a single word from Vincent's letters to his brother, famous letters to his brother Theo, which were key sources for the script. They had to sort of rewrite them as a kind of transcribed version of they made their own version of the letters, which sound authentic but aren't, etc. Or in the case of The Moon and Sixpence, Gauguin's son makes trouble for the production. You can't use my father's pictures. They'd intended to have a Gauguin as the punchline of the entire movie. Suddenly the film, The Moon and Sixpence, would go into Technicolor and we'd have a Gauguin masterpiece and so on. Absolutely not. The museum agreed, but Gauguin's son came in and said, you dare, because I think this film is a travesty of my father's life, so I'm not going to lend you the picture. There's many, many examples of this, and there's a wonderful example. There's a film called The Prince of Foxes, which is set in the Renaissance with Tyrone Power as Orsini, a swashbuckling painter. And if you could believe that, you can believe anything. But anyway, he wanders through the Renaissance, and in the press kit, it says, we made every effort to contact the heirs of Cesare Borgia in case we were being too rude about Borgia. But luckily, none of them exist. That the line seems to have petered out. So we can make Orson Welles into an out-and-out fascist, without anybody actually suing us. So these lawyers are all over these films. And that's an issue. You've got the pressure of censorship, the pressure of possible litigation. You've got the pressure of how much public knowledge can be assumed. You've got to sort of pirouette round all these obstacles in order to tell your story. It's quite a difficult act to pull off, actually, particularly if it looks really authentic, because people might actually treat this as a documentary, that if you have all that verisimilitude, it's very different to having a play or a book. You believe what you see, and that leads to all sorts of misunderstandings, I think.
Yeah, I can sort of understand that as well. As much as you want to have freedom in art, I remember there was a film about Shirley Jackson recently, which was based on a novel, not a biography. And in the novel and in the film, they suggest that she's sort of murders someone, essentially, that there's a death that she to some degree responsible for, and it's entirely fiction, but in every review it was called a biopic. And and that sort of it feels like that's a heavy responsibility, really, there should be a very large disclaimer at the front of that, because no one's going to read the biography. Everybody's going to watch the film.
Absolutely. The Shirley Jackson film was rather remarkable, wasn't it? That I forget her name, the actress who played the secretary in Mad Men.
Peggy Elizabeth Moss.
Wonderful performance, sort of repressed and mischievous, both at the same time. I thought she was wonderful in that, actually. But yes, I mean, people do confuse this with the real thing. And fascinatingly, the reviewers always, even today, when reviewing these films, are constantly doing a sort of one-upmanship of saying, oh, they got this little thing wrong. When actually that isn't the point. And I do say in the book, it's much too easy for scholars to do a one-upmanship game, and the curators do it all the time, saying, oh, Van Gogh didn't actually wear that hat, or it wasn't May, it was June, or whatever. And that's not the issue. It's making a convincing story. And so you just have to look at the mechanism, take these things seriously and look at the mechanisms by which they told those stories and what sort of things they had to do in order to create their truth, their biographical truth. What did they have to do? Is a much more interesting question than, has he got his beard on right, and so on, which is how most reviewers react to these things. They nitpick in order to show how clever they are, and I'm not sure that's particularly useful as a way into these films.
Absolutely, totally agree. And so we've seen a couple of examples of these myths in these films already. Cellini, as we already mentioned, has a sort of bohemian, avant la lettre of in his behaviour and his sexuality,
and a bit of swashbuckling. He's even made up to look like Douglas Fairbanks. I mean, he rushes around in tights, wielding a sword, and he's quite unusual amongst Hollywood artists because he gets on well with the court. Okay, he exploits the court and the court exploits him, but he knows who his patrons are and he knows which side his bread's buttered on. So he knows exactly how to behave in court and understands the kind of decadence of the Florentine court. That's quite unusual. I mean, I think all the other artists in the book, they conform to the mantra, kick authority in the ass. Basically, the whole thing about being avant-garde is you cannot possibly do any business with the establishment. So Cellini is unusual in that, and although it is a love-hate thing, I mean, he also takes the mickey out of the Duke of Florence, played by Frank Morgan, by the way, in The Affairs of Cellini, and he treats the whole thing as an audition for The Wizard of Oz. he behaves exactly like The Wizard of Oz. It's marvellous, but they weren't to know that in 1933.
Excellent, and a bonus when you're watching it though today.
Absolutely.
So let's move on to Lust for Life, because this is a huge production and is very important in sort of, to some degree as well, cementing the public's image of Vincent van Gogh. Kirk Douglas has a physical resemblance, as you point out, which is done very well and is exploited. And also, as you say in the book, there are loads of moments where a field is reconstructed in order to look like a painting. People are costumed, and the prop department, and the production design really becomes the forefront of the film. But at the same time, there is this public appreciation of artists, which is going to be very much determined by this particular artist as well.
Yes, it's true. And in fact, I don't know if you remember, but in John Berger's great book, Ways of Seeing, which went with his TV series, he had a page where he had painting by Van Gogh, one of his very later paintings, Crows Over a Wheat Field. painted in Auvers just before he died. And he has a reproduction of the painting on the page with nothing underneath it. You then turn over and you get a caption. This was the last painting that Van Gogh painted before he went mad and shot himself. And he says, your perception of the painting has completely changed in the light of that piece of biographical information. And suddenly you stop reading it as a painting, you read it as a piece of evidence about a disturbed mind. And so the swirling sky begins to look threatening. The crows look like figures of doom, and the wheat field is like fire, you know. Actually Berger didn't know this at the time, but it wasn't actually his last painting. He did several afterwards. On the day that he did the painting, he wrote to his brother saying, I'm having a wonderful time in the countryside. It's really restorative. Isn't it great to be outside the city? You know, by the way, send me my grant, and all the rest of it. And so, you know, he wasn't necessarily feeling disturbed when he did it. So that's one aspect of the film that has had a huge impact, which is reading Van Gogh as the archetypal mad modern artist. Self-taught, which he wasn't. He spent 4 years at an art school in Paris, by the way, although people forget that. Working on his own, actually not true. He networked with the Impressionists in Paris and of course famously shared the Yellow House with Gauguin, because he actually tried to found a community of artists in the south of France. So he didn't work alone. Expressive, yes. I mean, he definitely was not a sort of an artist who constructed or assembled his work. He did pour it out on the canvas in all sorts of different ways, but it created this absolute archetypal myth. And another aspect of the research for this is that just occasionally you get really lucky and you can do a piece of oral history. And I tracked down the guy that wrote Lust for Life, a man called Norman Corwin, who is, I don't know how you describe him, but he was the kind of David Attenborough of American radio, or the Melvin Bragg of American radio in the late 40s and early 50s. Very famous for his radio documentaries, particularly historical ones. And I interviewed him shortly before his 100th birthday. And he was the most extraordinary interviewee. I mean, he brought to the interview all these books with yellow stickets in them about, you know, so we could get all his references and so on. But he pointed out something that I hadn't noticed at all, and I'd seen the film many, many times. And that was this voiceover, where you have what sound like extracts from Vincent's letters being voiced over by his brother, Theo, played by James Donald. And Corwin said two things about that. One, they're not actually Vincent's words because, as we've said, Vincent's nephew refused to let them use the letters, so they had to paraphrase them. But secondly, and more importantly, because James Donald is doing the reading, it enables Kirk Douglas to be inarticulate. So although Van Gogh wrote these fantastic letters, they're probably the richest resource we have for any artist in the last 500 years. All their thought processes poured out to his brother, you know, writing 2 or 3 times a week, and his brother carefully keeps and annotates every single letter. So the wonderful letters by Van Gogh all are now said by the brother in order that Kirk Douglas can grit his teeth and look incredibly inarticulate and be on the cusp of trying to say something throughout, but not able to, so he pours it out on canvas. So the myth of the inarticulate artist is very, very strong in Lust for Life, and it was entirely created through this wonderful trick of the actor being inarticulate, but his words being spoken by someone who is articulate and is someone different. And I thought that was fascinating, actually. The other thing Corwin said was, you'll have noticed that most of the paintings that are emphasized in Lust for Life are paintings that are available in American museums. And that's part of it too. If you want to tell a story that appeals to your domestic audience, show them pictures they might have seen in reproduction in the newspapers, or they might have read about at auctions, or they might have seen in their local museum. So there's a big, so Starry Night and all these other paintings that are famously in America are emphasized. So that's another part of the story. Which paintings do they emphasize and why? A fascinating interview with Norman Corwin, actually, about this film. And I asked him, actually, I can never understand why Vincent didn't keep any letters from his brother. That he wrote all these letters to his brother Theo in Paris, but there's not a single letter, I don't think, maybe 1 or 2, of Theo to Van Gogh. Well, Van Gogh didn't give a damn about letters. He just screwed them up and threw them away. and he wasn't going to archive them and keep them and nurture them in the way that his brother and the brother's wife did. So, it became the archetypal film. Archetypal because, as you say, the production design is so detailed. And Vincente Minnelli, the director, came out of production design, was himself trained at Chicago Art Institute. So, I mean, he knew about art. He'd recently made An American in Paris, which famously has a long ballet sequence where Gene Kelly dances his way through the greatest hits of French painting, a bit of Duanier Rousseau, a bit of Van Gogh, a bit of Toulouse-Lautrec, etc. So he had form where this was concerned. Minelli worked for MGM for many, many decades. This was the only film that he initiated in his entire career. The rest were done as work for hire. This he initiated, and he thought it was his best film. He put a lot into it visually, and it is extraordinary. I mean, Freddie Young was the cinematographer on location, the chap who did Lawrence of Arabia and Ryan's Daughter and Dr. Zhivago, a great cinematographer. And he had the wonderful reminiscences about that wheat field with crows, that they dyed the field to make it look the colour of the painting. They moved the cherry tree so that it was in exactly the right position. But rather alarmingly, they tethered the crows to little bits of monofilament so that if they tried to fly away, all these people were lying in the wheat field, pulling these crows down again so they could stay in shot. So you've got crows on monofilament, you've got highly coloured wheat, and then you've got Kirk standing there being inarticulate, writing, "It's impossible. I can't do it." Bang. And etc. So, it's got it all. I love Lust for Life, but it distills really all the themes of the book in one great movie. And is still often shown. In fact, I did a talk at the NFT recently, and they screened on the big screen Lust for Life. Gosh, it looked great.
Right.
It really did. Yeah.
I mean, there are two questions I want to bring up about Lust for Life specifically. One, because I think that this is impactful on how artists are going to be shown and seen in the future after the film, which is one is the way it connects mental health to the act of creation, so that he isn't just an artist who has problems even that at Eternity's Gate very much suggests impede him rather than influence him, but in Lust for Life it's sort of like no the Dionysian sort of madness is part of the point. And the other point is that by aligning yourself to an artist, an actor or an actress, in the case of, say, Frida, for instance, can to some degree also reflect on their own status as an artist, that they deepen themselves. It's a little bit like American, I always think American male actors of a certain age always like to play boxers because it sort of underlines their masculinity and gives them, sort of underwrites what might otherwise be seen as an occupation they're slightly ashamed of.
Yes, it's true. They can still take their shirt off even though they're in middle age. Absolutely,
yeah.
But no, that's absolutely right. I mean, a lot of the press materials around these films stress, from Laughton onwards, as Rembrandt in 1936, right through to Mr. Turner, actually, and in fact Willem Dafoe in Eternity's Gate, stress the performance that in order to appear as this artist, the star went through all sorts of agonies, and they make all sorts of parallels between the suffering of the artist and the suffering of the actor who portrays the artist. So they're identifying with the artist. And in fact, in the golden age of Hollywood, actors were queuing up to play these parts. They're prestigious, they're awards fodder, they're great for the image. You suffer for your art, you put a lot into it. You can have lots of false whiskers and lots of makeup and all the rest of it. And so it became quite a thing, actually. And I mean, even with Mr. Turner, you have Timothy Spall quite rightly saying he went to art school to learn about how to be a painter, has in fact become a painter, which I think is not necessarily unique, but almost unique amongst these actors. He's actually developed a career as an artist as a result of appearing as Mr. Turner. So all of that, and the publicity stresses that he's a Cockney boy, he's from the ranks, he's just like Turner, he doesn't come from the establishment, etc. So that's very much part of it. But at a deeper level, I mean, as this book by Chris and Kurtz points out, that in the cliches about artists, I mean, it is impossible, famously impossible, to put over the creative act. So, because you just have someone sitting there looking intense And then suddenly they attack the canvas. It's like poets with quill pens or composers standing over the keyboard. I mean, there's a moment where you think, oh, God, come on. In fact, there's an egregious example of it in Hamnet, the recent film, where there's Shakespeare standing there on a jetty looking at the water. And I thought, he's not going to do it. He's not, in voiceover, to be or not to. I thought, oh, don't do that. I mean, it is such a cliche, that kind of approach to instantly having the sort of... So it is very difficult. So you take a sideways step in order to put over creativity, and it becomes madness. It becomes sexuality. It becomes all sorts of slightly pathological behavior. And that becomes the metaphor for the creative act, that creative people behave like that. And therefore, if you see them behaving like that, they're being creative, you know? And I think Van Gogh's so-called madness, and no one's quite sure, actually, in retrospect, was it epilepsy? Was he bipolar? What was actually going on? They're not quite sure. But in this, he sort of raves at certain points. He really loses it. And it becomes, as Chris and Kurt say, it becomes a metaphor for the creative act, which is probably inherently boring, actually. That the creative act is probably someone with great technical skill, thinking very hard, and actually then doing it. And that's not an awfully exciting thing to show. So take a sideways step and make him completely balmy. and I think that's actually very interesting. And a lot of the films do this in different ways, not to the extent of Lust for Life, but I think the Willem Dafoe one at Eternity's Gate is in some ways very, very clever. I mean, it makes the landscape look very dull and ordinary, because another aspect of these films is that as a point of honor, they make the entire movie look like the work of the artist who's being depicted. So Lust for Life, from frame one to the end, it looks like a Van Gogh. It's lit like a Van Gogh. Moulin Rouge is lit like a Toulouse-Lautrec, the John Huston film of 1952. Or Rembrandt is lit like a Rembrandt painting. So you say, and so even when Rembrandt isn't on stage, or when Lautrec isn't on stage, or Van Gogh isn't on stage, the world looks like that. So if the world looks like that, what's special about Van Gogh? I mean, he was just depicting the world as we can see it, as he can see it. And it's very rare to have a film where he sees the world like that, but nobody else does. And I've often thought, wouldn't it be interesting to have a film where, I don't know, everyone else sees it in black and white, or everybody else sees it, I don't know, in an expressionist way, and this particular artist sees it, because that's the point, that they're seeing the landscape in a particular way, not as we can see it. It's not a facsimile of the painting. In Lust for Life, you know, there's the bridge across the Arles Canal, and it's identical to the painting. And we're watching, oh yeah, look, he's doing a photograph. Gosh, how amazing. It looks exactly like the bridge. And what was good about Eternity's Gate, that he made the point of making the landscape look really dull, a lot of dead sunflowers and dead trees. But Van Gogh didn't see it like that. And when he put it on canvas, this wonderful light, this sort of thick impasto paint and all the rest of it, that I thought was quite brave, actually. He was trying to say, that's not how we see the world, it's how he sees the world. But again, it had quite a lot of the old cliches about, you know, being on the spectrum and all that sort of stuff. So he couldn't get away completely. But at least in terms of the visual experience, it was trying to say something interesting about how art actually works, I think.
Scorsese does something similar with The Aviator, although, I mean, obviously not an artist, but an engineer. Well, then again, actually, I would, you know, as a filmmaker as well as an engineer, and his engineering is artistic to some degree, where, you know, he goes playing golf and the green is you know, turquoise, and everything looks unreal, and it's because you're seeing things through his eyes. I thought as well at Eternity's Gate, one of the sort of traps that it can't help but avoid is that horrible sort of biopic thing where people meet in a cafe and say, Mr. Gauguin, you have to meet Vincent here.
I know.
Vincent. And it's, you know, you just, I don't know any way of doing that which isn't sort of cinematically clothed and
I know. I found a wonderful example of that in the book, a quote from, oh dear, I've forgotten his name, Alistair Cook, who used to be a great broadcaster on the BBC and did TV thing, where he has a fantasy about a 19th century dinner party. And oh, look, there's Georges Sand. Oh, goodness me, he's sitting next to, Bismarck. And who's Bismarck talking to? And he points out that, before photography, people probably wouldn't have recognized public figures. You'd have passed them in the street and not known who. How would you know what they looked like? And so there's this myth that everybody knows what everyone looks like. So, hello, Van Gogh, how nice to see you. And there's a film about the Brontes, where there's a wonderful thing. There's a hello Dickens, hello Bronte, all this sort of stuff, and it's almost like a parody. In fact, in Mr. Turner, there's a moment, hello Constable, hello Turner, and you think, hang on, is this a joke? No, it's a big thing in these films. I mean, how do you do exposition? How do you do the backstory without being clunky about it? I mean, it's all biopics, not just biopics of artists. You've got to. Do you have a rolling credit at the beginning which sets all the scene and tells you all the information you need to know, so it's all over with before the movie begins? Or do you actually weave it into conversations? And if you weave it into conversations, do you have oldie worldy English so they sound period, or do you actually have dialogue? I mean, today the trendy thing, post Peaky Blinders, is to have deliberate anachronisms. So you have anachronistic music in the background, anachronistic dialogue, and it almost celebrates the fact that we know this isn't historical. We know they'd never have spoken like this. They never say "no way" in the 1930s, but they say it all the time, etc. So that's part of it now. But in the 40s and 50s in Hollywood, they really agonized about how oldie-worldy they were allowed to get. And Darryl Zanuck, I found various memos from Darryl Zanuck, the great producer at 20th Century Fox, writing to everyone saying, stop being arty. Stop doing oldie-worldy language. Stop being flowery. We want people to say things directly so the audience understands what they're talking about. So all that's attention as well. Do you have period dialogue, or do you have direct dialogue with modern idioms? On the whole, you have the latter.
I want to talk about all of the chapters, obviously, but I don't want to keep you too long. I mean, one we can't pass by has got to be Charlton Heston in The Agony and the Ecstasy and his Michelangelo, because this is, well, as you've already said, it's not a film that's necessarily successful, and you make a point of saying that other than Moulin Rouge, a lot of these films don't actually, they kind of flop at the box office. They're not, and they're not necessarily beloved of the critics either, because they're so vulnerable to the kinds of criticism you've already talked about. Let's talk a little bit about Charlton Heston then. I mean, to begin with, he's Charlton Heston, so he's never going to be mistaken for Michelangelo.
No, exactly. And there's a famous moment. There was a press conference in Rome because the film was made at Cinecittà Studios, or De Laurentiis Studios in Rome. And so they had a press conference, and somebody said, you're about 6 foot something, and Michelangelo was famously short. Isn't that a bit peculiar? And Charlton Heston replied rather sweetly, "I'm not sure I'm big enough." And I thought that's very nice. That was sweet, actually. But,
I do like the idea of Peter Falk, though. That was a big.
Yes, it was a possible. He wanted it, but they didn't audition him. He'd have been about right, I think, actually. And there were various people thought of, Richard Burton, Marlon Brando, Spencer Tracy as the Pope. Actually, I think he'd have been better than Rex Harrison. But various people, and you get, if you read the trade magazines, I get endlessly fascinated by reading Variety or the Hollywood Reporter. All these rumors about who's going to play Michelangelo. They somehow. These whispers start and turn into columns in these trade journals. But yes, I mean, the thing with The Agony and the Ecstasy was that it's based on this biographical novel by Irving Stone, like Lust for Life was. And it's this odd genre of, which they call biographical fiction, which is pretty well researched, doorstop novels, which kind of novelize the archive. So there's lots of detail, but rather sort of soap type dialogue and so on. And you protect yourself from litigation by basing the film on a pre-existing property. So you base it on an Irving Stone novel, and an awful lot of these films are actually based on novelizations of the artist's life for that reason. But the novel is about the entire life of Michelangelo, from his apprenticeship with the Medicis right through to his death. And Philip Dunn, the scriptwriter, thought, I can't dramatize that. There's just one little bit. It's about sort of 20 pages in the novel, is the painting of the Sistine Chapel. Let's make that, and let's make it a two-hander where you've got the Pope, Julius II, in conflict with Michelangelo doesn't want to be treated as a servant. He wants to be treated as a fully fledged artist. The Pope treats it as a commission. And so out of that collision comes the story. And it's interesting because there isn't much action. I mean, it's just painting the ceiling, basically. And there's a wonderful moment, actually, which I found in the archives, where they thought at one point they might film it in the Sistine Chapel. And the Vatican actually gave permission. And then suddenly someone said, hang on a minute, it's about the painting of the ceiling. Last time I went to the Sistine Chapel, actually, it's already painted. We can't cover it in whitewash. Oh, yes, that's right. So they built their own. They built their own Sistine Chapel in the De Laurentiis studios, 10% bigger than the real thing, with movable walls so that the camera could whiz around the place and do all these shots, and got all these transparencies of each panel of the Sistine Chapel from the Vatican. So he reveals the transparencies by removing paint, is the trick. And it's incredible. I mean, today, if you watch Conclave or The Young Pope or any of these other things, it's all done digitally. So you think you're in the Sistine Chapel in Conclave, when actually all they had in reality was some benches, and the rest is painted in digitally. So they didn't have a problem of building a huge full-scale actual size plus Sistine Chapel, but they had to do that. And I mean, visually, it is extraordinary. They found a drawing of Michelangelo of his scaffolding, which is this strange kind of wooden construction that doesn't touch the walls. So again, very well researched. So, they have him doing a bit of a debate about, was he lying on his back or was he standing up when he did the ceiling? We now think he was standing up and leaning backwards. But at the time, in the mid-60s, they thought that he was lying down. So you have Charlton Heston lying down and, painting these frescoes by himself. We now think he had at least 6 assistants from Florence to help him, as of course he did. I mean, for goodness sake, it's hundreds of square meters of ceiling. You had to do the
school of, surely. I mean, that's
Yeah.
all these artists have a school. It's like
Exactly.
it's the same today. Hans Zimmer doesn't, write down every note. He has a whole building full of composers, which he essentially creates Hans Zimmer soundtracks.
Exactly, but in out there, artists work alone. They don't need help. They don't need networks. They don't need assistants. They don't need patrons. They don't need to be taught. They are loners. They strike out alone. So Michelangelo strikes out alone. I think the scene where he suddenly gets inspiration to do the Sistine Chapel ceiling is one of the greatest cliches of the creative act in the history of the movies. There you have Charlton Heston stumbling around the mountains above Carrara, where he gets his marble. And he can't work out, he doesn't like the existing design of the chapel ceiling, which is the 12 apostles. So what am I going to do instead? And he looks up and the clouds form into God creating Adam, the famous moment of the touching of the hands, that moment of electricity that kickstarts the human race. And in voiceover, Charlton intones, and God created human beings in his own image and all the rest of it, and man and woman created he them. And you get the MGM studio orchestra at full whack, it's an amazing moment. But I mean, as the critics said, oh, I see, if the weather had been different, the Sistine Chapel wouldn't have happened. I mean, it's a crazy, it's externalizing an internal moment in the way that, Van Gogh gets externalized by behaving in this strange way and so on. It's this metaphor for the creative act. It's very, very difficult to do. By the way, it was animated. The clouds were animated by Walt Disney's people.
Walt Disney, yes, you mentioned that. It makes it even more Monty Python than I previously thought.
No, absolutely. And it's a shame because it's also a shame because Carol Reed, very distinguished filmmaker, The Third Man, The Fallen Idol, those wonderful films of the late 40s, early 50s, had his career almost ruined when he made Mutiny on the Bounty and was fired. And Lewis Milestone, a veteran whose career was ruined by it, took over, and a really blighted production, Mutiny on the Bounty. So this is Carol Reed's comeback movie. How can I show Hollywood that I can cope with a big budget movie, stay on budget, cope with the egos of the stars, and it's not Marlon Brando this time, so we stand a chance of finishing the movie, and so on. And so he's being very well behaved so well behaved it has a kind of religious, reverential feel that's very ponderous. He's being too goody-goody by half, I think, as a film. But visually, I think The Agony and the Ecstasy, I watched it in a 70mm print a couple of years ago at Bradford Widescreen Festival. My goodness, it looks fantastic. The scenes in the chapel are really, really amazing, actually. Beautifully shot. Leon Shamroy and the money shot, which is the camera. It's the mass to celebrate the completion of the ceiling, and the camera goes up, turns round, and like today, it would almost be a drone shot. From above of the congregation, and then you see all the details of the scene. It's a fantastic shot. They wanted a crane to do it, but amazingly, the crane was stuck in Salzburg making the Sound of Music. So unfortunately, they couldn't get a crane for The Agony and the Ecstasy, so they had to make do with a camera pointing upwards and twirling. But no, the money shot is fantastic in that film.
Are there any films where you feel that it kicks against those cliches that have become ingrained in our concept of the artist?
Well, I think there's bits. There's Eternity's Gate, the cliche of how the whole world must look like the work of that artist. I think that was one. Mr. Turner, with the grinding of the paint and the marketing, that these people aren't just operating in isolation. They're professionals who have to sell their work. I thought that was more recently. I think Frida. I mean, a woman artist. My goodness, it took till 2002 for Hollywood to make a film about. Well, there'd been Pollock with. Lee Krasner, Marcia Gay Harden, who actually won an Oscar for Best Supporting Actress. So there had been a sort of a film which acknowledged the fact you could have women artists, but it wasn't until 2002 that you have a movie entirely about a woman artist, Frida. And again, you can tut and be very critical, but then you look at the standard histories of art by Gombrich, The Story of Art, or Janssen, Art History. Gombrich, which was the best-selling outline book about art. It isn't till the 18th edition of Gombrich that he even mentions a woman artist, Kata Kollwitz. Before then, it's as if they didn't exist. So Hollywood's simply reflecting what the textbooks are saying. So, it's too easy to blame the filmmakers sometimes. They're reflecting what art history was doing at the time. But anyway, Frida redressed that balance. So you get elements where... where films sort of dent the cliches, but or a Caravaggio by Jarman, where he places Caravaggio in the gay community in Rome, and they're all having a wonderful party. So there's lots of networking and lots of he sucks up to his patron, the cardinal, in order to get work and so on, played by Michael Gough. Do you remember? And all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's all that. But, it's a flashback. He's on his deathbed. The story is told very similarly. They're incredibly difficult to shake. You can dent the cliches, but they're really difficult to shake off. I mean, they go very, very deep in society, I think. And that was the point that Chris and Kurtz made, that what they called enacted biography. We've internalized these cliches so much that it looks odd if an artist doesn't behave like that.
It almost becomes punkish that they're
exactly.
Gilbert and George are wearing suits, so that becomes a thing in and of itself.
Yes,
but I was
exactly.
wondering about documentaries as well. I think one of the most entertaining ones is Exit Through the Gift Shop, which was Banksy's.
Banksy.
And that really interrogated the sort of cliches of the artist, and especially that idea that anybody can be an artist, and it's like, well, maybe this guy can't.
Yes, yes. No, that was it's clever because the whole thing is like a practical joke, the movie, isn't it? On the filmmakers, and you never quite know who's conning who when making that film, and is it about Banksy at all, or is it about some avatar who's pretending to be Banksy and all that sort of stuff? No, I think, but in the nature of the Banksy phenomenon, it raises. Yes, I mean that's a very good example, I think, of really challenging the cliches head on. You know, he's not an individual; he's a collective. We don't know who he is. We don't know if he works alone. We don't know. Well, we do know he went to art school, I think. So yeah, no, he puts a cross against most of the checklist of the cliches. But that's a fairly extreme example. And as that film showed, it's impossible to make a biopic of Banksy. It turns into something else.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, final question, Sir Christopher. I always ask for a recommended film book at the end of the episode. So, have you had any film books that you would like to recommend to our listeners?
Yeah, I thought the exhibition of Tim Burton's work at the Design Museum was very, very special, actually. And the catalogue of that exhibition about Tim Burton's visual universe, I think, is very, very well put together. I liked it. It's a quintessentially visual filmmaker of a very distinctive kind. He has his own visual universe, and the puppets, the drawings, the sketches, the kind of visual influences that I thought that was very, very cleverly put together, actually. And
he appears in your book under as Big Eyes.
Big Eyes, indeed, yes. Well, I was a little bit impish by in a chapter on terribly serious artists like Frida Kahlo and Jackson Pollock. I thought, I'm going to slip that one in as an American artist that has been the subject of a biopic. And because, again, it's trying to say, out there, outside the art world, she's probably the one they've all heard of. You know, out there, it's a different world. And I mean, in a way, you know, you're asking about sort of consistency in the things that I write. If I have one abiding thing that I'm trying to do, it's to attack snobbery in the art world. Snobbery about spaghetti westerns, snobbery about Hammer films, snobbery about art. And so trying to look at it from outside our world and see what does it look like out there, what are the assumptions, and isn't that an interesting process? I think, you know, if there's one thing that really links, you know, Sergio Leone, Terence Fisher, and the Hollywood history of art, it's I can't bear snobbery in art and hierarchies in art. And in the same way, I don't like in literature this distinction between literary fiction and genre fiction. I really don't like those distinctions. It's either well written or it isn't. It's either a great movie or it isn't. And a lot of the rest is just baggage. So that was one of the driving forces in writing this book. And, you know, everything I do will be actually fundamentally about that issue. You know, I don't like snobbery.
Oh, I really agree. I was thinking back to Hamlet when I read that. I thought, oh, well, this is sort of good fan fiction. You know, I mean, it's good at what it does and everything, but it is, you know, to think of it as this sort of high literary fiction thing is I think, a pretense, you know. Well,
same with the girl with the pearl earring, exactly the same phenomenon, you know.
Right, Tracy Chevalier, Oh, the one last thing I have to say, it did make me smile very much when I was reading the introduction and you had the point about Titanic, paint me like one of your French girls.
Exactly. And then you look at the drawing and it looks nothing like an avant-garde drawing of 1912. It looks like a science fiction illustration from the 1990s. I mean, and also it's very prudish. You know, Picasso wouldn't have cut it off at the waist, but this drawing does. Yes. I mean, just a final story. I mean, one I mentioned about, you know, how this grew out of my teaching. I used to finish the course with the showing of the Tony Hancock film, The Rebel. And as a kind of cabaret, because it's got all the kind of cliches about what is modern art, going to Paris, eating snails and putting on a beret and all this sort of stuff. But a moment came where, if you remember in The Rebel, there's the good paintings, which are done by Hancock's flatmate, played by Massey, do you remember? And they're sort of rather timid Cézannist still lifes and landscapes, as contrasted with Hancock's infantilist, as he calls it, paintings, which are like children doing, you know, really bad drawings. I showed it at the Royal College, and one day the students preferred Hancock's paintings to the Massey paintings. They actually thought they were better. I thought, at this point, the movie's become a tragedy. It's not a comedy anymore. It's all about how no one understands this misunderstood genius played by Tony Hancock. At that point, I stopped showing it.
It became too dangerous at that point.
It did. But, so, you learn a lot through teaching.
I totally agree. I'm going back to the grind tomorrow in Venice, no less. So,
all right. Gosh. Good luck to you. Good luck to you.
Thank you so much, Sir Christopher. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure talking to you once more.
I enjoyed it very much. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.